The war room aboard the Galactic Coalition flagship Valor Prime was silent. Not the normal kind of silence. This was the kind of silence that crawled across the room like a living thing, pressing down on every officer present. At the center of the chamber stood a single figure, hands bound, posture relaxed, and eyes filled with something that unsettled every alien in the room. The human. Commander Elias Ward. Across from him towered General Carvex, Supreme Warlord of the Dravari Dominion. Carvex was massive even by Dravari standards, nearly 3 meters tall, covered in layered crimson armor plates that were not merely armor but part of his biological exoskeleton. His yellow eyes glowed faintly beneath a heavy brow ridge. For 2 centuries, Carvex had been the terror of 3 galaxies. Entire civilizations had surrendered the moment his fleet appeared in their skies. And now, he was staring at a single human prisoner. The other species present shifted uneasily. The Valari ambassador folded her slender arms. The insectoid Kith observers clicked their mandibles nervously. And the towering stone-skinned Thraxans simply watched in complete silence. Humans were new to the galaxy. New, and deeply misunderstood. Carvex stepped forward slowly, each step echoing across the chamber floor. Human, he growled, his translator implant converting the deep alien language into harsh common. Elias Ward looked up calmly. Yes. The simplicity of the response made several officers glance at each other. Carvex's claws flexed. You stand before the Supreme Warlord of the Dravari Dominion, he said. The conqueror of the Valari moons. The breaker of the Thraxan war fleets. Ward tilted his head slightly. Should I applaud? Several officers gasped. Even the translator drones paused for half a second. Carvex's eyes narrowed. You mock me. Ward shrugged. You're doing introductions. I assumed you wanted a reaction. The Dravari general stepped closer until his massive shadow covered the human. You are a prisoner, Carvex said slowly. Ward glanced down at his bound hands. Ah, he said. Right. That. The human looked back up at the towering alien. And here I thought this was a diplomatic meeting. The Valari ambassador nearly choked. Carvex's tail lashed violently behind him. Your fleet is destroyed, the general snarled. Your world will fall within the next cycle. Your species will kneel. The room fell silent again. Every alien present knew the truth behind those words. The Dravari Dominion had never lost a war. Not once. And humanity had only joined the coalition 30 years ago. They were young, unproven, small. Carvex leaned closer, his breath hot and metallic. I will give you one opportunity, human, he said. Kneel before me. Beg for your species. And perhaps I will allow a few million of you to survive. The chamber went still. All eyes turned to the human. Elias Ward stared at the Dravari general for a long moment. Then he did something no one expected. He started laughing. Not a nervous chuckle. Not forced bravado. Real laughter. Loud. Uncontrolled. Several officers physically recoiled. Carvex's eyes flared with rage. You laugh? The general roared. Ward wiped a tear from his eye. Oh wow, he said between breaths. You're serious. The Dravari warlord's claws slammed into the floor with enough force to crack the metal plating. You stand moments away from death, Carvex growled. And you laugh. Ward looked up at him again. And smiled. General, the human said calmly. You just threatened a Deathworlder. The word echoed through the chamber. Deathworlder. Several alien officers stiffened immediately. Even Carvex paused. Deathworlds were rare. Extremely rare. Worlds where the environment itself tried to kill its inhabitants every second of every day. Most intelligent species evolved on stable planets. Gentle climates. Predictable ecosystems. Earth was not one of those worlds. Earth had hurricanes. Earth had earthquakes. Earth had predators. Poisons. Viruses. Volcanoes. Ice ages. And gravity that crushed weaker species. A death world didn't produce ordinary beings. It produced survivors. Carvex's eyes narrowed. You believe your species is unique? He sneered. Ward tilted his head. No. He smiled wider. I know we are. The Dravari general straightened to his full height. You are one soldier, Karvek said coldly. I command a fleet of 12,000 warships. Ward nodded thoughtfully. Impressive. Then he leaned forward slightly. How many wars have you fought, General? Karvek bared his fangs. Over 200 campaigns. Ward raised an eyebrow. Across how many worlds? 37. The human nodded again. Not bad. The casual tone made Karvex's tail twitch. Ward's smile faded slightly. Now let me ask you something, the human said quietly. How many wars have humans fought against each other? Karvex frowned. That information is irrelevant. Ward chuckled softly. Let me give you a hint. He looked around the room at the watching alien officers. Thousands. The word landed like a meteor. Thousands of wars, Ward continued calmly. For territory. For resources. For religion. For politics. For reasons so stupid we barely remember them. The Valari ambassador stared at him in disbelief. Ward looked back at Karvex. You've conquered 37 worlds. Humanity fought over one world, for 10,000 years. Karvex scoffed. Primitive brutality. Ward nodded slowly. Exactly. Then his eyes hardened. You think threatening us scares us? The human leaned forward, chains clinking softly. General, we grew up in hell. For the first time since entering the chamber. Karvex hesitated. Ward's voice became quieter. Colder. You think war is terrifying? War is our history. You think death scares us? Death is part of our culture. You think conquest impresses us? Ward grinned again. We invented it. The chamber felt colder. Even the Thraxans shifted slightly. Karvex growled low in his throat. You speak boldly for a prisoner. Ward shrugged. You speak boldly for someone who doesn't understand what he just started. The Dravari general stepped closer again. You will die today, human. Ward tilted his head again. Maybe. Then he smiled again. But not before my fleet arrives. Karvex laughed loudly. A deep, thunderous roar. Your fleet? The Warlord gestured to the massive viewport behind them. Outside, the blackness of space stretched endlessly. There is nothing coming. Ward glanced over his shoulder toward the stars. Then he looked back at Karvex. Check again. One of the bridge officers suddenly froze. General, the officer whispered. Karvex turned sharply. What? The officer stared at the sensor display in horror. I'm detecting warp signatures. Karvex snarled. How many ships? The officer swallowed. I can't count them all. The room went silent. Ward leaned casually against the restraint post. Still smiling. 12,000 Dravari warships floated outside the station. The largest armada the galaxy had ever seen. And yet, the sensor officer's voice trembled. New contacts emerging every second. The Valari ambassador stepped closer to the display. Her eyes widened. That's impossible. Warp signatures filled the screen. Hundreds. Thousands. More appearing every moment. Karvex's claws slowly curled. Identify them. The officer zoomed in. Human ship designs appeared across the display. But something was wrong. Very wrong. These aren't coalition vessels, the officer whispered. Ward chuckled softly behind them. No, he said. They're not. Karvex turned slowly. Ward's eyes gleamed. Remember when I said humans fought thousands of wars? The human nodded toward the screen. Turns out, we got really good at building fleets. The sensor officer's voice cracked. General, we're counting over 40,000 ships. The entire chamber erupted into chaos. 40,000. No civilization had ever fielded a fleet that size. Ever. Karvex stared at the human. You're bluffing. Ward shrugged. You're welcome to test that theory. Then the human looked toward the viewport again. And smiled wider. Oh. Looks like the heavy hitters just arrived. The stars outside twisted violently. Massive warp rifts tore open across space. Ships emerged that dwarfed everything around them. Titan-class human warships. The largest weapons humanity had ever built. The sensor officer whispered in terror. 300 Titan-class vessels. Karvek stared at the display. For the first time in 2 centuries. The Dravari warlord looked uncertain. Ward leaned back calmly. Still laughing softly. You threatened a human general? He met Karvex's eyes. Now you get to meet the rest of us. The war room erupted into chaos. Alarms began screaming across the bridge of the Valor Prime as every sensor array struggled to process the impossible number of warp signatures flooding the system. Dravari officers shouted over each other. Warp breach detected. More ships emerging. Energy readings off the scale. Outside the viewport, the stars twisted like liquid glass as new vessels arrived every second. Human vessels. Hundreds. Then thousands. And they did not arrive in neat formations like most galactic fleets. They arrived like a storm. A massive, unstoppable storm. General Karvex slowly turned back toward the human prisoner. Elias Ward was still leaning casually against the restraint post. Still smiling. Still laughing softly under his breath. You're bluffing, Karvex said again, but this time the words carried less certainty. Ward tilted his head. You keep saying that. Another officer spoke in a trembling voice. General, we have confirmed counts now. Karvex didn't take his eyes off the human. How many? The officer swallowed. 42,000 warships. The chamber fell silent. Even the non-Dravari observers froze. 42,000. No empire in galactic history had ever deployed a fleet that size. The Dravari Dominion's 12,000 ships had already been considered overwhelming. Now they were outnumbered nearly 4 to 1. And the humans were still arriving. Ward nodded toward the viewport. You might want to call your fleet commanders. Karvex snarled. I do not take orders from prisoners. Ward shrugged. Suit yourself. Outside the station, space had become a battlefield before the first shot was even fired. Human fleets formed rapidly into layered formations. Massive Titan-class ships moved to the center. Carrier groups spread outward. Destroyers and cruisers formed protective rings around them. The Dravari fleet began shifting nervously in response. Their ships were powerful. Heavily armored. Designed for brutal close-range combat. But the human fleet moved differently. Fluid. Adaptive. Constantly adjusting positions. Like predators circling prey. A Dravari tactical officer shouted suddenly. Human ships are powering weapons. Energy spikes across their entire formation. Karvex's claws tightened. Return fire immediately. But the officer hesitated. General, they are not targeting us. The room went still again. What? The officer enlarged the display. The human fleet wasn't targeting the Dravari ships. Not yet. Instead, hundreds of small human craft detached from the main formations. Fast. Extremely fast. They're launching fighters, the officer whispered. Karvex sneered. Point defense will shred them. But the officer kept staring at the screen. They're not heading for our ships. Everyone leaned closer. The fighters weren't approaching the Dravari fleet. They were heading straight for the Valor Prime. The station. The command center. The heart of the Dominion's operation. Ward chuckled behind them. Step 1, he said quietly. Take out the brain. The first explosions hit the station seconds later. The entire war room shook violently as external defenses erupted in flashes of fire. Alarms screamed. Multiple hull impacts. Defense grid collapsing. Karvex roared in fury. Intercept them. But it was too late. Human fighters swarmed the station like angry insects. They dodged point defense fire with terrifying precision. Missiles slammed into shield generators. Energy beams carved through defensive turrets. Within moments, the once mighty defense grid of Valor Prime was crumbling. Ward watched calmly. You know what humans learned during all those wars we talked about? No one answered. Ward smiled. We learned that big armies aren't everything. Another explosion rocked the station. Speed matters. Boom. Creativity matters. Boom. And sometimes, the largest explosion yet ripped through the station's outer hull. You just have to punch the enemy right in the face. Outside, the real battle began. The Dravari fleet finally opened fire. Thousands of plasma cannons lit up the darkness of space. Energy beams streaked across the battlefield. Human ships exploded as the first volleys connected. But the human fleet did not retreat. They surged forward. Like a tidal wave. Massive Titan-class ships fired their primary cannons. Each shot was a beam of white-hot energy powerful enough to split a cruiser in half. Dravari vessels began exploding across the battlefield. Destroyers launched missile storms. Carriers unleashed waves of fighters. And through it all, human ships kept advancing. Closer, closer, closer. Because humans did not fear close combat. They preferred it. Back inside the war room, chaos continued. Smoke filled the air. Sparks rained from damaged consoles. The Valari ambassador clutched a railing as the station trembled. "What kind of species does this?" she whispered. Ward answered calmly. "The kind that grew up on a death world." Carvex turned toward him again, fury burning in his eyes. "You planned this." Ward shrugged. "You captured me. You threatened Earth. You gave us an excuse." Carvex bared his fangs. "I will tear you apart myself." Ward raised an eyebrow. "After your fleet survives this?" The Dravari general turned toward the display again. His fleet was losing. Badly. Human tactics were unlike anything the Dominion had encountered. Instead of rigid formations, human ships constantly shifted positions. They adapted to enemy fire. They exploited weaknesses instantly. They fought like predators. Like pack hunters. Another officer shouted. "General! Enemy boarding vessels approaching our flagship." Carvex froze. Boarding? Humans used boarding tactics more than any other species. Because humans were terrifying in close quarters. Ward grinned. "Step 2, he said quietly. "Get personal." Minutes later, the sound of distant explosions echoed through the station corridors. Gunfire. Screaming. Metal tearing apart. Human boarding teams had arrived. Armored soldiers stormed through the station like a hurricane. Their weapons roared. Their movements were fast, precise, merciless. The Dravari soldiers fought back fiercely. But humans fought differently. They didn't just fight to win. They fought like survival itself depended on it. Because for most of human history, it had. The war room doors suddenly exploded inward. Smoke filled the chamber. Dravari guards raised their weapons. But shapes emerged through the smoke. Humans. Heavy combat armor. Rifles glowing with heat. One of them stepped forward and removed their helmet. A woman with scarred cheeks and sharp eyes. She glanced at Ward. "Commander," she said calmly. "Sorry we're late." Ward grinned. "Traffic." The soldier cut his restraints quickly. Carvex roared in rage. "You dare bring war into my command center?" The human soldier turned toward him slowly. Then she smiled. "General," she said. "You threatened a human." Behind her, dozens of armed soldiers entered the chamber. Weapons raised. The Dravari guards realized something horrible. They were surrounded. Part 3, The Price of Threatening Humanity. The war room fell silent. Outside the viewport, the battle still raged across space. Ships exploded. Weapons flashed. But inside the chamber, the moment had become strangely calm. General Carvex stood at the center of the room. Surrounded. Human soldiers aimed their weapons directly at him. Elias Ward stretched his arms slightly after the restraints were removed. "Much better." Carvex glared at him. "You think this is victory?" Ward looked around thoughtfully. "Well, your fleet is collapsing. Your station is captured. And you're currently surrounded by very annoyed humans." He shrugged. "Looks like victory." Carvex snarled. "I will never surrender." Ward nodded. "We expected that." The human commander stepped closer. "For the record, General, this war wasn't necessary." Carvex spat. "Weak species exist to be conquered." Ward sighed. "That mindset always ends the same way." The Dravari warlord raised his claws. "You think humans are invincible?" Ward smiled faintly. "No." Then his eyes hardened. "But we are very, very hard to kill." At that exact moment, The final report came through the station's damaged communication system. Dravari Fleet Command. This is Captain Ria Solari of the Terran Defense Fleet. Her voice echoed across the war room. Your fleet has been defeated. Remaining vessels are surrendering. Any further resistance will result in total annihilation. The message ended. Karvik stood perfectly still. His empire's greatest fleet, gone. Destroyed in less than 2 hours. Ward crossed his arms. You had one advantage, General. Karvik slowly looked at him. Numbers. Ward nodded. But humanity learned a long time ago that numbers aren't everything. He gestured toward the human soldiers. Sometimes it's determination. He nodded toward the viewport where human ships filled the stars. Sometimes it's preparation. Then he met Karvik's eyes. And sometimes, it's the simple fact that humans don't respond well to threats. Karvik let out a long rumbling breath. You fought like monsters. Ward chuckled. That's what everyone says. The Dravari general looked toward the viewport again. Human ships controlled the battlefield now. The war was over. Finally, Karvik lowered his claws. Very well. The room went still. I surrender. The Valari ambassador gasped. The supreme warlord of the Dravari Dominion? Surrendering. Ward nodded slowly. Good choice. Karvik looked back at him. You laugh at war. Ward shook his head. No. I laugh at people who start wars they can't finish. Hours later, the battlefield had grown quiet. Human ships moved through the wreckage, rescuing survivors. Prisoners were taken. Weapons were disabled. And for the first time in centuries, the Dravari Dominion had been defeated. On the observation deck of the captured station, Elias Ward stood beside Captain Solari. They watched the stars silently. Solari finally spoke. You really laughed in his face? Ward grinned. He threatened me. She shook her head. You humans are insane. Ward thought about that. Then he shrugged. Maybe. He looked out at the human fleet filling the darkness of space. But if someone threatens humanity... His smile returned. We tend to laugh first. Then we bring the entire species with us. And that was the day the galaxy learned something important about humans. You could insult them. You could challenge them. You could even fight them. But if you ever threatened them, the Deathworlders would laugh. And then they would win.